Ooh. Hello YouTubers! My name is Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have for you Reaction Request 165. This is me starting back up the Horus Heresy series from Arch Warhammer. This is part 2 because, well, I've reacted to part 1 already. CJ Falcon was the one who requested I restart the series, so let's check it out. And 3, 2, 1, play. Bum bum. Bum bum. Dun 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 dun. Greetings
and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Horus Heresy lore summaries. We are now on the second part of the first book. Whether or not any further books will be split into 2 parts will very much so depend upon the scale of the book. Some of them are heftier than others, shall we say.
Understandable.
But I would not take it as a matter of course that they will all be split in 2. It all depends upon the sheer volume of stuff inside of it. So, with that out of the way, let's get back to the lore stuff, shall we? Last time, I left you off with Loken's invitation to attend a meeting of the so-called Warriors' Lodge that resided within the Lunar Wolves Legion. Loken was brought well down into the bones of the vengeful spirit, down in the various maintenance pathways and forgotten hallways that honeycomb such massive ships as the vengeful spirit. At first, the meeting itself seemed harmless enough. There was a certain veil of secrecy and ritual to proceedings that Loken found disturbing. But all in all, the lodge itself appeared to be fairly harmless. It was, as it had claimed, a simple gathering of warriors, where the various members of the Legiones Astartes could converse with one another without the constraints of such things as ranks, ritual, or traditions, where a private could speak to a captain as an equal without having to worry about any rebukes coming down later on. And while strict and unflinching adherence to rules and regulations, not least of which was of course the command structure, was not only necessary but of utmost importance within an organization like the Legiones Astartes, Loken nevertheless could see the benefits of having such an organization, where there could be a bit more levity between the various members of the legions. It could, for example, bring to the fore issues that the lower ranks had with their commanders. It would also allow those very lower ranks to become a bit more comfortable with their commanders, and vice versa.
Nice.
Not to mention the simple fact that even though Legiones Astartes are quite different from normal men, they do still have certain urges and needs, and camaraderie and fellowship is most certainly one of them. All in all, Loken concluded that the lodges appear to be little more than a meeting place, and while, again, the subterfuge and the secrecy of all of it disturbed him, he could not see anything that was outwardly wrong with this particular lodge system. I would remind you at this point that Loken did not know about the origins of the lodges. In fact, very, very few within the legions knew at this point. Only the higher echelons within the lodges knew that the lodges had originally been introduced to the Lunar Wolves and many other legions by members of the Word Bearers. And in the case of the Lunar Wolves, it was introduced to them via Erebus himself. Not that that information would have made much matter to Loken at this particular time. Erebus was, at this point, an honoured brother and a valued friend and advisor to the Lunar Wolves, the Mournival, and to Horus himself. And after spending a cozy evening with his brothers, Loken left relieved. He had imagined all manners of horrors resting within the heart of the Legion. He had imagined cults filled with wicked Astartes conducting secret rituals in the bowels of the vengeful spirits. But, after all, it was apparently just essentially a drinking club, where brothers could go to simply be brothers. The revelation of the true face of these warrior lodges was as of yet far, far into the future. For now, we return to the world of murder. The 63rd Expedition had recently linked up with the elements of two different expeditionary fleets. The Blood Angel Expedition, which had originally put out the distress signal, was of course still in orbit, although its Legionis Astartes contingent had all been dropped down to the planet below. But there was also a contingent of the Emperor's Children available in orbit. The Emperor's Children contingent had been commanded by Lord Commander Adolin, who had dropped his entire force directly down onto the planet pretty much the moment they had arrived.
Wow.
Horus was not best pleased by this course of action, but at the same time he was not currently in a position to let his displeasure show too obviously. Horus needed the two other expeditionary forces to help him out with actually attacking the planet of murder and hopefully saving the Astartes forces already committed. And if he openly rebuked the commanding officers and, well, hauled them over the coals, so to say, they would probably be less than cooperative. And by the very same token, if you simply just hauled them out of their plushy little commanders' chairs and shot them right then and there on the deck in front of their crews, the next guy would probably also be a little bit hesitant. And hesitation was not what Horus needed right now. It was bold, decisive action to get down on the planet and rescue the Legionis Astartes. But at the same time, it had to be cold and calculated.
Rather
the previous
calculated.
forces had simply hurled themselves at the unknown and had, quite possibly, been annihilated because of that. Horus was not about to do the same thing. However, this left him once again with a bit of a conundrum. How was he to rebuke the officers in charge of this catastrophe while still maintaining both their love and their loyalty? Well, this is where the Mournival comes into the picture. The Mournival is not an official Legion body. Garviel Loken does not represent the 10th Company, nor does Abaddon represent the 1st Company. Nor do they in any way represent Horus. They are merely 4 captains voicing their individual opinions, and as it so happened, in a meeting with the Mournival, Horus, and the various commanders of the various expeditionary forces, they voiced their opinions very loudly and very clearly. Tariq went to great lengths in impugning the honor of the Emperor's Children. Abaddon went so far as to say that he would have had the commander of the Blood Angels expedition, the human commander, mind you, shot for lesser actions of folly.
Wow.
And the Loken's own condemnations were barely any less scathing. The Mournival, to put it rather bluntly, heaped every last ounce of scorn upon the expedition commanders that they could possibly do, while Horus played the conciliator, reining in the worst excesses of his Mournival officers, and if not excusing, then at the very least ameliorating the worst follies of the expedition officers. This way, the officers were in absolutely no doubt that they were getting messed up well and proper, but at the same time Horus appeared as not only the rescuing hero, but also as a sympathetic ear, someone who understood that while they might have made mistakes, they were not necessarily to blame. Horus was the kindly uncle that protected them from his war dogs.
Wise.
Unbeknownst to the other expedition's leaders, Horus had made it abundantly clear to the Mournival that steps would be taken to ensure that any real incompetence that had taken place here would be severely punished down the line. But for the moment, Horus needed officers and not scapegoats.
Yep.
And according to Axaman and Tariq, this was not the first time that Horus had used the Mournival as his war dogs, baying for blood and, well, bitching out the people that Horus simply could not bitch out himself. The Mournival was in many ways also a political tool that Horus used to get his way, and he used them rather deftly. Loken had some misgivings as to this. He understood, of course, that it was necessary, and particularly in this case, and that it was very, very beneficial to the Lunar Wolves, to Horus, and indeed the situation as a whole, but at the same time, he was not entirely comfortable with the idea of being used in such political theatre.
Yeah.
And now, let's talk a little bit about the planet
Politics.
Murder itself, because you might be wondering, why wouldn't the War Master simply just drop down onto the planet and rescue whatever was left of the Legion forces? Hell, why were the Legion forces left in the first place, you might wonder? Well, you see, the planet Murder was a little bit odd. According to the reports of the other expeditionary fleets, once the Blood Angel expedition had arrived in orbit, it appeared to be no different than most other planets. The Blood Angels had dropped onto it in limited forces at first, but as soon as they entered the planet's atmosphere, it suddenly erupted into violent planet-covering storms, buffeting and throwing the drop pods and transport crafts off course, many of which were assumed to be destroyed. All communication was lost with the first spearhead. Further Blood Angel forces then followed those forces in the hope of regaining contacts. Slowly but surely, the 3 companies of Blood Angels that were assigned to the expedition were drip-fed down into this storm. And when the Emperor's children arrived on the scene, they simply hurled their own Adeptus Astartes directly into the maelstrom itself to rescue the Blood Angels.
That sounds wise.
Nobody actually used the word rescue. Reinforcing them was the operational term. The planet itself was also not particularly friendly. The environment, of course, was extremely hostile, with raging storms pretty much covering the entirety of the planet, which made any and all long-range communication entirely pointless. It also made navigation difficult, to put it rather bluntly. Planet-side, it was entirely, or at least as far as we know, covered in stalk-like growths of very, very tall and thin grass that reduced visibility to virtually zero. The Emperor's children that had dropped down on the planet, like the Blood Angels before them, had been scattered to all directions of the compass, having been thrown many, many, many kilometers across the planet's surface. Some had gathered up in smaller clumps, others had been almost entirely separated. The various transport crafts had either been thrown massively off course, or simply been dashed against the planet below. And due to the constant and never-changing weather patterns, any form of Vox communication, be it short or long range, was virtually impossible. Short-range Vox could at best be expected to reach out to a range of 10, maybe 20 meters, with heavy interference, and any communications at longer ranges was entirely impossible.
Wow,
and that,
what a
of course,
storm!
Included contact with the Navy in orbit. In all due reality, the Emperor's children were stranded, separated, and entirely lost. Although they would not be lonely for very long. The planet was very, very far from uninhabited. The creatures that came to be known as the Mega Arachnids were very, very large, arachnid-like creatures that traveled on several spiked legs, wielding scythe-like talons extruding from their torso.
Wow.
These creatures were extremely quick, lightning fast, to the point where even Adeptus Astartes' reflexes were just barely able to keep up with them. And to make matters considerably worse, seeing as there was virtually no visibility whatsoever, the only warning of an impending mega-arachnid attack was a split second of vibrations in the stalk surrounding the marine before a flash of silvery talons would arc towards his chestplate, which, by the way, offered virtually no protection whatsoever, The mega arachnids' natural claws and talons were perfectly capable of penetrating Astartes' battle plate. Although, now that I mention it, the Astartes quickly noticed that their attackers, although appearing biological without any clear indications of mechanical augmentation, they did also appear to not be entirely natural in nature. They appear to have been biologically engineered. The mega arachnid warrior forms were highly specialized. Every single limb was a weapon, and they moved with a lethal speed, and struck with an expertise and instinctual perfection that even the Emperor's children found very, very hard to match. And even the best amongst them were pushed to their absolute limits. A young Emperor's children captain by the name of Lucius remarked upon the exceptional speed, ferocity, and skill with which the mega arachnids fought. And considering Lucius's towering ego, that was high praise indeed. Lucius had at this point joined up with another captain of the Emperor's children, Saul Tarvitz, along with a few other members of their respective companies. Not a large force, but something, certainly. They, slowly but surely, fought their way across the planet of murder, without any real goal in mind, but eventually they saw a large stone tree, and decided to head towards it, because, well, it was the only real landmark they had found so far, so it was better than nothing.
Yeah.
When arriving at the stone tree, they noted that it was in the midst of a large clearing, the first one they had seen so far.
Wow.
And impaled upon great stone spikes protruding from the tree's trunk were the Blood Angels, or at the very least, what little was left of them.
Wow.
Tarvitz ordered the stone tree destroyed with what C4 they had available to stop this desecration of their comrades. But before his orders could be carried out, the Emperor's children ran into another variation of the mega arachnids, a flying form that snatched several of the Emperor's children up into the air, where they were either eviscerated or impaled upon the cruel stone spikes of the tree. But now that the Emperor's children had regained a measure of visibility, they could start utilizing their bolters to their full effectiveness. The weapons had been rendered virtually useless by the almost 0-second warning of the close-quarters fighting in this tall grass. But here, in the open clearing, Astartes' bolters proved absolutely devastating against the mega arachnids, their shells punching easily through the arachnids' natural armor and exploding within their squishy, frail bodies, blowing off limbs, shattering torsos, and destroying heads. Eventually, charges were planted along the base of the stone tree, and it was destroyed. The resulting explosion drew other elements of the Emperor's children to their positions as well. This was not originally a part of Tarvitz's plan, but it was a nice side effect.
Yeah, it helped.
An even better side effect was that the trees had somehow been creating the weather disturbances. This now became blindingly obvious aboard the expeditionary fleets in orbit. Torgaiden was the first to notice that a part of the storms had simply stopped. A clearing in the world-covering storms had appeared. Torgaiden begged Horus to allow him to take forces down onto the planet immediately, assuming that something must have happened and that there were likely to be survivors near the disturbance. Horus could not with good conscience do so. After all, he had just rebuked the other Imperial commanders for dropping their forces down onto the planet without a plan, and at that time there had simply been, well, no time to actually formulate a plan. The destruction of the stone tree took place mere hours after the meeting between the various commanders of the expeditionary forces. There had been no time to really analyze the weather patterns or come to the bottom of it. Horus had remarked that some of the strange messaging buoys placed around the planet, which was odd in and of itself since the planet showed no sign of having a habitation capable of placing anything into orbit, was sending out signals that he seemed to find reminiscent of a sort of music, but no one had as of yet been able to decode their signals. But plan or no plan, it was obvious
decoding
that
is
something
difficult.
had to be done, and this was an opportunity, and there was no way of knowing how long this opportunity would last, or if they would ever get to see another one. Horus once again used the Mournival to do what he could not. He allowed Torgarden to argue the point that at the very least, a reconnaissance in force should be made. He would take several company-sized formations of lunar wolves in rapid drop deployment. Drop pods, thunderhawks, and stormbirds would swoop down upon the clearing, and at the first hint of the storm resurging into the area, they would immediately evacuate.
Fair enough.
While this was not a brilliant or particularly detailed
it's better
plan,
than nothing.
it was good enough.
Yeah.
And it allowed
Good
Torgarden
enough.
to take all of the responsibility, the glory, and potentially the blame for the expedition. Meanwhile, while Tariq was organizing the spearhead, back down on the planet, the Emperor's children had found themselves with some new friends, both of the good variety and the not quite so good variety.
Oh, yeah?
More Emperor's children, including the command staff under Adolin himself, had seen the explosion and the change in the weather patterns, and had rallied upon Saul Tarvitz's position. Adolin wasted no time in rebuking Saul for what he saw as a waste of demolition charges. To add insult to injury, he then ordered Saul Tarvitz and Lucius to go and rummage through the rubble of the tree to recover any keepsakes, memorabilia, or relics of the Blood Angels that could be given back to the chapter. But before the two captains could get too far in their search, they were interrupted by their new friends. The Mega Arachnids had apparently taken umbrage at the destruction of their stone tree, and were swarming into the clearing in their hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
The Emperor's children organized a defense quickly, and with all of the skill and position for which they were rightly famed. And now that they had a certain range to work with, bolt guns and heavier weapons could be brought to bear against the enemy with their full effect. Nevertheless, the sheer weight of numbers of the Mega Arachnid warrior forms and the flyers were set to overwhelm the Emperor's children when Tariq's spearhead landed. The Lunar Wolves came down directly in the Mega Arachnid hordes with drop pods and thunderhawks and stormbirds, scattering the assaulting Mega Arachnids under a heavy barrage of fragmentation rockets, hurricane bolters, and assault cannons.
Nice.
After the initial shock of the landing, the Lunar Wolves quickly formed up around the Emperor's children, and together they carried out a savage counterattack that scattered the remaining Mega Arachnid forces, killed those who would not flee, and sent the rest running into the jungle. It would, however, appear that this was not quite enough of a taste of battle for Tariq, as he approached Lord Commander Adolin and gave him one hell of a dressing down, much to Saul Tarvitz's secret delight. But unfortunately for that very same captain, the war on murder was not quite finished yet. By the way, Murder is the name attributed to the planet by the Astartes upon it. And you can imagine that a planet that make Astartes name it Murder is a rather vicious fucking place.
Well,
at this
there's
point,
animals
recognize that the giant stone trees were probably the
that
cause
can tear them
for the
open
clearing
with
in
their
the
own
weather.
claws.
And the reason for this was partially the Mega Arachnids' counterattack. They brought with them both the normal soldier forms, the flyers, and also massive digging creatures, huge larvae-like monstrosities that scooped up the stone-like material left over from the tree, omnom-nommed it for a little while, and then shat out building blocks, which the soldiers then began to reassemble into yet another tree. The assumption then was made that the Mega Arachnids were trying to rebuild the tree because it was a part of their defensive network. They were creating the storms to keep the Astartes out.
Nice!
Another sneaky ploy for a bunch of insects, but considering that this was the only place on the planet where the storms had ceased, and also the only place on the planet where the trees had fallen, well, 1 + 1 often equals 2. Oh, and
Yeah.
by the way, Lord Commander Adolin now informed the various other commanders that it was his idea to cut down the tree. Tarvitz was, a little bit miffed by this, but he was
Really?
a good line officer and would not call out his commander. Not in front of other legions at the very least, although Tariq confronted him later on and asked whose ideas it really was. And upon further pushing, it was indeed revealed that Sal Tarvitz was the one that took down the tree. Granted, he didn't do it because he suspected it might be controlling the weather, which, granted, would be a fair bit of a leap of logic. Hey, there's a rock tree over there. It must be controlling the cocking weather, but nevertheless, why is not important. He did it, and as such,
Pretty
I think he should have some of the credit.
sumptuous.
But, well, the Emperor's children has changed quite a lot since they were known as the Emperor's diplomats. And something else had changed as well. The Lunar Wolves and the Emperor's children were no longer the only ones that had responded to the Blood Angel's distress call. The warp was once again torn asunder, and vomiting forth from it was the Blood-Red Angel himself, Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels Legion.
Wow.
He brought with him a lot more Blood Angels. After conferring with the War Master, it was decided that the Lunar Wolves, the Emperor's children, and the Blood Angels would all make war upon the Mega-Arachnids of Murder. Rarely was such an obvious threat identified, and especially so late in the Crusade. Horus himself pointed out that it was refreshing to have a clear enemy in front of him once again, a foe so clearly alien and so unremittingly hostile that there was absolutely no other way to deal with them but with bolter and chainsword. And so the Angel and the War Master brought murder to murder.
There you
The
go.
Primarchs landed their full strength upon the planet and set about eradicating the Mega-Arachnids. And while you might at first think that such a relatively simplistic species wouldn't offer much in the way of resistance against two expeditionary fleets led by two Primarchs, it turned out that the Mega-Arachnids had two advantages. One, they had had a lot of time to prepare for this, and two, they had bloody prepared. Their numbers were overwhelming.
Wow.
They were stretching into the billions, and every single Mega-Arachnid, presuming they could actually get into close quarters combat, was more than a match for an Adeptus Astartes. Unfortunately for the Mega-Arachnids, the Astartes now knew their game and took countermeasures, leveling the vast fields of tall grass and cutting down their stone trees, as well as deploying their heavier weaponry. Amongst them was the Emperor-class Titan, the DS Irae. The force of this massive machine of war, along with the two Primarchs, was a lot more than the Mega-Arachnids had bargained for. They were still able to reproduce in astonishing numbers, and would launch massive wave assault upon the Astartes positions. Millions upon millions of Mega-Arachnids would throw themselves at thousands upon thousands of Astartes in day-long battles of mass annihilation.
Just throwing themselves.
This conflict dragged on for quite a while, until it was interrupted by the appearance of another fleet. This was
Which
no
fleet
Imperial
is this?
fleet, however, and at first it was assumed that the Mega-Arachnids had been able to send out some form of signal, and had received reinforcements, despite the fact that there was no sign of the Mega-Arachnids being able to travel through space, and much less so the warp. The misunderstanding was, however, quickly resolved when the fleet began talking to the Astartes fleet, something the Mega-Arachnids had never even attempted. It was communicating in the same strange musical language that the buoys had been emitting. This finally gave Horus the eureka moment he needed to translate the language. The fleet was asking them why they were assaulting the planet if they had not seen the warnings. Far from being reinforcements, these newcomers were the Mega-Arachnids' jailers.
Oh!
These newcomers called themselves the Interrex. They claimed to have defeated the Mega-Arachnids in a long-ago war. But rather than exterminating them as the Imperium would have done, they had confined them to the planet below, taken away all of their technology for creating spacecraft and for traveling through the warp, and then placed sonar buoys, both to monitor the mega-arachnids and to warn off any that might trespass.
Okay.
Communication between the War Master's fleet and the Interrex were quickly established. It turned out that the Interrex were humans. They were one of the many small enclaves of humanity that had managed to survive out in the great void after the fall of humanity's first interstellar empire. And in time, they had built an empire of their very own. They had expanded quickly across their section of the galaxy, conquering some lesser species, but very rarely, if ever, exterminating them. They had begun to integrate them. One of these races were the Kinnenbacht. They were the first large civilization they encountered. At that time, the Kinnenbacht civilization was old and dying. They had once ruled a mighty empire, and they had been around in the galaxy since before humanity. This seems to suggest that they might have been one of the creations of the Old Ones. Additionally, the Kinnenbacht had some very interesting technology. They were vastly superior to the humans of the Interrex when technology was concerned, and as we will later learn, they were also capable, at least in some limited extent, of controlling, harnessing, and, most importantly, weaponizing the warp. Although I hasten to add that back then, when they were doing this, the warp was nowhere near as tumultuous as it is today. They were harnessing quite literally the warp, not necessarily chaos. And I'm pointing this out because it is not entirely certain that the Kinnenbacht were actually influenced or even corrupted by chaos. They were not necessarily using chaos in its purest form. Back then, in the mists of time, the Eldar also used the warp as a tool and created weapons that utilized the power of that unknown universe. So, despite the rather obvious case of chaos influence, it doesn't necessarily have to be chaos as we know it. They could simply have found a different way of utilizing the warp like the Eldar did. Anyways, the Interrex somehow managed to overcome the Kinnenbacht, but again, rather than exterminating them, they integrated them into their empire. The Kinnenbachts gave them their superior knowledge of technology and also, at least partially, their knowledge of the warp. They also seem to have taught the Interrex many, many interesting things, including, as we will discover later, a theory about chaos, which is very fascinating indeed. And this also was no temporary inclusion. They had actually existed, Interrex and Kinnenbacht, side by side for 3,000 years. They had built a remarkably stable, multicultural, and indeed multi-species society.
Nice!
This, however, did not, as you might well imagine, tickle the fancy of the Astartes. The delegation was brought aboard the vengeful spirit to start official diplomatic talks. The moment it was made clear that parts of the delegation were Xenos, well, that sent quite a ripple through the gathered Astartes, to put it rather bluntly. However, Horus immediately put that down and made it very clear that the Interrex were guests and diplomats and were to be treated as such, which is a remarkable show of lenience for someone in his position within the Imperium. Also, at this point, in case you're interested, we get a description of the Kinnenbacht, so I will be quoting directly from the book here. They were hefty, simian things, with eyes so oddly sunken beneath big brow ridges that they were just sparks in shadows. Their flesh was blue-black and deeply creased, with fringes of rousette hair so fine it was almost like feather down, surrounding the bases of their heavy angular craniums. Mouth and nose was one organ, a trifold split at the end of their blunt jaw snouts, capable of peeling back, wet and pink, to sniff, or opening laterally to reveal a comb of small sharp teeth, like a dolphin's beak. There is also a mention of their smell. Apparently they had a thick, earthy smell, which, while not downright uncomfortable, was unmistakably not human. After the little confrontation on the embarkation decks, the Warmaster wished to continue talks with the Interrex, which, again, I like to stress, this was very unusual. The Imperium does not talk to xenospecies, even if those xenospecies are in some way entangled in an existing human population. The Imperium shoots first, and then maybe asks some questions of the corpses later. But in this case, the Warmaster openly treated with the Interrex, and even went so far as to offer an apology for transgressing upon their territory and attacking the Mega-Arachnids on murder. He in fact went so far as to issue them an official apology, not just for himself, but on behalf of the Imperium for their perceived transgressions. This was unprecedented. As far as I can tell, no other Primarch, or indeed the Emperor himself, has ever treated with a Xeno civilization this openly. There had been minor cases of very, very strained diplomacy with the Eldar, but nothing like this. These talks were also held entirely on the Warmaster's authority. There was some rather hefty blowback afterwards. Abaddon was so furious that he even yelled at the Warmaster himself, which also was a pretty goddamn unprecedented occurrence. Ezekiel Abaddon had a volatile temper at the best of times, but directly doubting his Warmaster and even shouting at him, that is quite the thing. Little Horus Aximand was less vitriolic, but still doubtful. Garville Loken kept his own judgment, and Tariq, well, he was just deeply uncomfortable with all the yelling. Interestingly enough, Sanguinius also kept his own counsel, only using his position to reinforce his brother. The argument, as mentioned, got rather heated, with Abaddon eventually getting sent out of the conclave and told to not come back until he had learned how to behave, basically. Horus sent little Horus Aximand after him to try and calm him down and tell him that if he would wish for the Warmaster's forgiveness in a few hours, he might be willing to hear it, although he expected Abaddon to come crawling in on all fours. Horus was not used to being questioned, not even by his Mournival, and being yelled at, well. Primarchs tend to have a rather prickly ego, and a temper that even Ezekiel would be jealous of. The discussion went on for a little bit longer, but it was very clear that the Warmaster had made up his mind. He would follow the Interrex to a planet specifically set aside for diplomatic relations with newly discovered races, species, and other empires, and he would listen to what they had to say. Presumably at this point, he must have been planning somehow to either integrate the Interrex into the Imperium, or perhaps he simply was intrigued, wishing to learn from them.
Well, they definitely have information to give.
Horus, previous to this, had a little bit of a heart-to-heart with Garville Loken, talking a little bit about his past. This is, amongst other things, where we get to hear a little bit of a snippet about the Emperor. Apparently, the Emperor was born, quote-unquote, somewhere in Anatolia. Now, precisely how the Emperor was born, if he was born a human or some other thing, there's no mention. We do, however, get a mention that the year before the Emperor was born, a piece of artwork was made in the Persian Empire, representing the dreaded Sagittarius, a centaur with a bow. Now, horse archers is not really that much of a rarity in that part of the world, so that doesn't really narrow things down much. The Persian Empire narrows it down a little bit, but the thing is, the Persian Empire is a fairly vague term. It lasted, in very, very general terms, and we're talking about the dynasty, the families, the histories, etc., rather than perhaps the nation itself, somewhere between 550 BC to 651 AD. Now, this could specifically be talking about the Persian Empire during the times of Alexander the Great, who conquered it, for example, or it could be referring to the empire that existed after that under various Iranian chieftains, in which case, as we mentioned, we stretched all the way up to 665 after the death of Christ. So it also doesn't narrow it down all that much, but the mention of a horse archer does put me in mind of the later empire, since it was conquered by those very horse archers, the Ottoman Arabs, that took over and created the Ottoman Empire. It could potentially also be a reference to the Scythians that were around during Roman times, so, again, not much of a narrowing down, but it's
maybe
something.
It's just vague.
We also get to know a couple of other things about Horus Lupercal. The book in which this art piece was represented was a book about astrology. It represented the dreaded Sagittarius as a stellar constellation. The book was apparently a gift from the Emperor to the, relatively speaking, young Horus shortly after rediscovering him. The young Primarch had apparently had a voracious appetite for knowledge, and was particularly fascinated by the stars, so his father gave him this ancient book on astrology.
Nice.
This must have been a priceless artifact. This was an old age piece, written long before the collapse of Terra. That would be like giving someone a genuine manuscript somehow preserved from ancient Roman times today, an absolutely priceless artifact. We also get to hear that Horus, at least in part, identifies with the Sagittarius. He is a weapon of war, the greatest weapon of his age, just like the horse archer at one point was.
Yes.
He is a tool created by the Emperor to conquer the galaxy in his name. And there is no particular rancor in this statement. He doesn't seem to, mislike the Emperor for this. He simply seems to accept his role.
Makes sense.
He does, however, also let it show that he feels he's under enormous pressure as the War Master. Horus is a Primarch. He's capable of handling things that humans would consider impossible. He can orchestrate entire galactical campaigns literally in his head. But even he is feeling the strain of being the supreme commander of the entire Grand Crusade. He's feeling a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit lost. All of his brothers are calling for his attention. He's supposed to go do this, go do that. He's supposed to accommodate the new orders from Terra. He's supposed to accommodate the newly dispatched administrative personnel that has been sent out to tax the newly conquered planets.
Supposed to do all of this crazy
stuff. Take care of the
stuff.
remembrance order that has been sent out. He's supposed to overlook all of these million things while everyone is shouting in his ear for his attention. And it is really starting to weigh on him. On top of this, he feels that the Emperor gave him this responsibility as a heavy weight. He is not, in his own words, allowed to make mistakes.
Wow.
And he feels he has already made two. The first, he says, was the war against the false Emperor, which we talked about in part 1. He blames himself for the loss of his beloved Sejanus. He says that he should never have sent him. He should have known, and he should have seen some way to avoid bloodshed. The second mistake was the Mega-Arachnids. He looks at the Interrex, their way of not exterminating their enemies, but rather granting them mercy, granting them life and clemency, and he admires that. He is convinced that he needs to be the perfect leader, and the perfect leader does not have to fight a war. A perfect leader should simply be able to pacify civilizations without the effort. He feels that these were mistakes. He also feels that the Emperor would have found a way. He is convinced that the Emperor would want to talk with the Interrex. He, Horus, thinks that the Interrex are interesting, finds their ways intriguing, and he therefore thinks that there should be some value to them, and they should, potentially even, be integrated into the Imperium. And the Emperor would not only have known this, but the Emperor would have been able to do so. The Emperor would of course also have known about the trap laid for poor Sejanus. Garviel Loken points out that perhaps Horus is being too hard on himself, but Horus denies it. Horus believes that the Emperor needed him to be his perfect warrior, and therefore nothing less than absolute perfection could ever be enough. This is a really interesting part of the book because it gives us a glimpse into Horus's psyche. He has an enormous
definitely a bit about his humanity.
And he's not sure that he can actually handle it. And this demigod, this superhuman being, beyond superhuman, has real human doubts. And perhaps he sees the Interrex not only as a way to prove to himself that he can do this, but also possibly as a way to avoid making future mistakes. Perhaps he figured that he would not have lost Sejanus if he could simply have talked to the false emperor and his people, if he could simply have made him understand that the Imperium was so much more, then maybe none of this would be necessary.
Yeah.
Maybe, at least partially, it is the Imperium's fault. He mentions the Imperium comes to burn, to conquer, to eradicate, while the Interrex have apparently rejected that solution and instead found some way to show mercy and clemency, even to Xenos like the Mega Arachnids. And I suspect there is a hint of pride in this as well. Horus thinks that he should be able to do this. If the Interrex have been able to subjugate the Kinnenbrock into their empire, then surely he, the greatest amongst the Primarchs, the Emperor's chosen, should be able to do so as well. We also get some small snippets of information about the growing Imperial cult. Euphrates Keeler, after her, to put it rather mildly, stressful experiences in the Whisperheads, have found God, or, well, the Emperor anyways, and has begun praying to him. She has joined the growing movement of the Lectitio Divinatus, and apparently the cult is growing. They are even, to a very, very small and secret extent, distributing flyers and printed versions of that very Lectitio Divinatus. And although no real numbers have been presented, judging by the events later off in the book, I would probably say that the Imperial cult at this point in time within the expeditionary fleets would be pretty damn small. Probably only something along the lines of 2 to maybe 5% of the expedition's total civilian complement. But that's enough once again about boring old humans. Let us return to the buff demigods and their tight-sitting armor. We are now introduced to a new character, one that will become rather infamous throughout the series, namely Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers Legion. He had joined the Lunar Wolves shortly before they ran into the Interrex, and he was one of the voices who argued for meeting the Interrex, although he also argued that certain steps should be taken to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Sanguinius departs the legions, having backed up Horus in this. I'm not entirely sure about Sanguinius' opinions on this. Then again, you gotta remember that Sanguinius is quite severely indebted to Horus. He considers Horus to be the best of them. And if Horus thinks that this is the right thing to do, odds are that Sanguinius would just go with it, assuming that there was something he had missed. That was why he never made his own thoughts on the matter known, as I'm assuming they would probably go contrary to what Horus was thinking here, but nevertheless. The Lunar Wolves, along with the Interrex, were brought to one of their outer systems. This was a solar system specifically designed, again, for the reception of foreign guests and diplomatic envoys. Horus was really making an effort. He had surrounded himself with various learned people and less military personnel, and the Interrex seemed to appreciate this. He was given, amongst other things, a tour of their city, going through their various civilians' quarters, etc., while the Legionaries and Horus were confined to a visitors' part of the city. This is also when we first run into the rather special weapons that will end up playing a rather large part in this particular story. It was during a visit to the Hall of Devices, a museum of sorts, that they ran into these Kinnenbrachte weapons. The Interrex had done exactly the same as the War Master had, while the War Master had brought forth the more artistic and more scientific elements of his own gathering, the Interrex had brought their military might to the fore, both making an effort to please the other. And let's return to the Hall of Devices for a moment. This is when we run into one of the special Kinenbracht weapons, which, as we've talked about earlier, was probably somewhat chaotic. These were known as tailored weapons. They were described as sentient metal, crafted by the Kinenbracht metallurgists, a technique now utterly forbidden, and they called them the anathames. When such a blade is selected for use against a specific target, it becomes that target's nemesis, and able to overcome, quite literally, everything, it would appear. A perfect assassin's tool. I'm honestly surprised that the Interrex would not place this stuff in a far heavier guard. I mean, this place was guarded, but in all due essentiality, it was a large museum. This would be like having a fully operational tank on display in a museum, or a fully operational nuclear warhead, to be more accurate. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing you'd normally have on display, to be honest. Anyways, later that night, the War Master and part of his delegation was invited to dinner, where the diplomatic talks could continue. Horus was very, very eager to get some kind of commitment from the Interrex to an alliance, or at the very least a non-aggression treaty. On the other hand, the Interrex were very, very hesitant. On one hand, they were very, very interested in these humans that had come from a faraway galaxy. On the other hand, it was an overwhelmingly militaristic branch of humanity, led by someone who called himself the War Master. Not
definitely seems suspicious, doesn't it?
To put it rather mildly. It is during this visit that we have a rather interesting conversation play out in front of us, with Garviel Loken talking to the captain of the guard of the household they were currently visiting. They were talking about chaos. It would appear that the Interrex had feared that the expedition was infected with chaos, which is, to be honest, not an entirely unfair assessment. They were, after all, met by the War Master and his army of massive fuck-off warrior monstrosities. Most civilizations would probably be just a teensy-weensy nervous about that particular arrangement, but they had no idea. The Expeditionary Force didn't understand this. Loken himself had very, very recently been introduced to the utmost basics of the warp, and he had no concept of anything such as chaos, and the way it was described to him seemed utterly alien, as a great, malevolent, sentient entity that was out to destroy everything. It would appear that we had a political breakthrough here. The Interrex had simply mistaken the Expeditionary Force for something they were not. There was no lingering taint in the Expeditionary Force. There was simply the most surprising of naivete. Deliberately so, in all due likelihood. However, this was around about the time that the Hall of Devices was broken into and a bunch of people murdered violently, and one of the anathems stolen. As you can probably guess, this put the Interrex somewhat on guard, unsurprisingly, seeing as the only ones who would probably do this, well, was their honoured guests. The captain of the guard asked that Garviel Loken hand over his weapons, something that Loken was in absolutely no position to do with his War Master on sight. The only solution to this was to start beating each other bloody with power-armoured fists. And suddenly, the war against the Interrex had kicked off. All forms of diplomatic relations were now rendered impossible. The Interrex, on their behalf, thought that they had almost been fooled by these agents of chaos that had revealed themselves but a moment too soon, whilst the Expeditionary Force didn't have the faintest fucking clue what suddenly happened. Horus, of course, said that he had nothing to do with the attack and the break-in and the Hall of Devices. The Interrex didn't believe him. And while we don't really get any real information about what they knew, considering their technology level, it would probably be not too much to assume that they had probably found some way of, well, identifying their attackers through a vid feed or something along those lines.
It makes sense.
It is very plausible that they knew who had attacked them.
One of the basic urges of technology is
there,
being able to see what's going on when you're not there.
Who he was, considering he was one of the gargantuan fuck-off dudes in power.
Recording devices.
There are not particularly many visitors that fit that description. And on the other hand, the Intrex didn't understand the significance between the difference in armor. As far as they were concerned, they were all just Imperials. They didn't understand that Erebus would represent a very, very different take on the Imperium than the Lunar Wolves would. And so this particular interracial love story ends, as all good love stories do, with lots and lots of screaming violence and blood, with the Lunar Wolves, under the direct command of Horus, teaching the Interrex precisely what an Adeptus Astartes Legionnaire is. Even though the Legionnaires were heavily outnumbered, and in many cases caught completely by surprise, they butchered their way out of the Interrex quarters and rejoined with the rest of the Legion forces on the planet, after which they pretty much fucked up the entire place and then headed back up into orbit. The Interrex would have to be dealt with later. From what the Legions knew, they were a vast civilization, and would probably require the attention of multiple legions to deal with effectively, something that Horus did not have time to do now. Granted, I'm a little bit surprised by this. No matter how under pressure Horus was, you'd think that this would probably be a huge priority to crush the Interrex, considering what they just did to him. Horus is a slightly touchy individual after all, but on the other hand, he might simply have seen this as yet another failure, and therefore he wanted to remove himself from the arena of his failure as quickly as possible. And while that might seem a bit petty for a demigod, I honestly expect that Horus's personality is a lot more fragile than we might have first given him credit for. Again, I'm quoting from the book here. This is Horus speaking. "Why have you tasked me with this, Father? Why have you forsaken me? Why? It is too hard. It is too much. Why did you leave me to do this on my own?" Again, I suspect Horus is feeling abandoned at this point, crushed by the weight of responsibility. He wasn't ready for this. How should I put it? To some extent, I suspect, protecting his own ego by saying this, by indirectly, at least at the moment, blaming the Emperor for what he perceives to be his failures, while at the same time he holds the Emperor to an impossible standard. Again, I remind you, he figured that the Emperor would find a peaceful solution. He figured that the Emperor would be able to do anything. And since Horus wanted to do that, and even more, he felt that the Emperor
an amazing specimen of a man, but he never wanted to be held as a god. It's an interesting
little bit of psychology there. On one hand, he's holding the Emperor to, as I mentioned, an impossible standard, a man that can do anything and everything, even giving peace to aliens and integrating them because they're humans, despite their rather obvious heretical tendencies. But at the same time, when he failed in doing what was virtually impossible, he then took the blame on himself, and since it was his fault, he shifted it onto the Emperor, the man who had given him that responsibility. This is probably already where we start seeing the first seeds of what was to grow into the Horus heresy. And of course, at the end of the book, it is revealed that Erebus was the one who stole the weapon, which again, I kind of blame the Interrex for this. Erebus had, he might have had an honor guard with him, maybe a squad, so Erebus and 10 Astartes burst in there and took the weapon and left again. Alright, I mean, that's 11 Astartes, that is certainly a fairly considerable force, but damn, why would you put something like that on display to begin with? It just seems a bit absurd to me. Then again, on the other hand, the Interrex might not simply have imagined the damage that could be done by assassinating a single individual, which, well, considering their own history of warfare, I kinda doubt it, but still, what happened happened, and Erebus, the sneakiest sneak who ever snuck, decided that this would be a great idea to steal. How he came up with this, I'm not entirely sure. There has to have been some form of demonic guidance already at this early point, because I mean, this is one hell of a leap of logic. Okay, I'll steal this thing, I'll stab Horus with it, and then I'll be able to turn it to the dark side. Now, it is revealed a little bit later out in the book series that he has had some kind of revelations about all of this, but they're never really all that specific. He just talks about plans millennia in the making, etc., etc., but it'd probably be fairly safe to assume that Daddy Zinch told him at least a fair bit
Makes
of this.
sense.
Alrighty then, so that was the first book.
Part 2,
Oh my.
the first book.
This is a bit long, isn't it? But oh well, hopefully it'll all be enjoyable.
Well, I hope so.
Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all
You
again
too,
soon.
Arch.
Have a good day.
Alright, so that was Arch Warhammer's Horus Rising Part 2, which apparently was on the Horus Heresy series books, and this was requested by CJ Falcon. I will be continuing this series as we move on. If you want to go check out Arch's stuff, there's a link in the description. Go check it out. There's some pretty cool stuff there. All sorts of lore, gameplay, all sorts of stuff. So go check it out. Things I've learned. Well, a lot. Because a lot of this is, like, not mentioned in the other basic stuff. So, like, I remember there being something about the stolen weapon. In one of the videos. But it didn't go in detail about the race that had made the weapon. That's cool. That there was a human race out there that had made peace with an alien race. And sure, the alien race was dying off, but how amazing of the alien race to, I wouldn't say adopt, but bring in the humans, allow the humans to bring them in, and teach them. Maybe it was some urge to, they knew that they were on the decline, and they wanted to pass it on to an heir. And so here's these strong, independent humans that, because my theory is they weren't strong enough to eliminate threats, so they spent the resources to encapsulate and capture such aliens, such as these, what was it, mega or super arachnids on Planet Murder. That's, you know, that's a pretty interesting title for a planet. Definitely stay away from that planet. Very interesting stuff. Quite neat. My thoughts on it. Well, this is leading up to the actual events of the Horus Heresy, which will be interesting to see. So, I guess we'll just keep moving forward with it. I think I'm going to leave it there. So, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.